Before you believe another headline about Social Security, stop for just a moment. Something important is happening in Washington that's getting millions of Americans talking. And if you receive Social Security, SSI, SSDI, or any federal benefits, today's update could directly affect you. But here's the problem. There's a lot of misinformation online, and many people don't know what's actually true. In this video, we'll separate fact from fiction, explain what has really happened, who could be affected, and what it means for your benefits. So make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with me until the very end, because the details matter and you won't want to miss a single update. Something major just happened in Washington, and if you or someone you love receives Social Security, SSI, SSDI, or has been waiting on stimulus relief, you need to hear every single word of what I'm about to share with you, because this is not a rumor, this is not speculation, and this is not clickbait. Congress has moved, legislation has passed, and the impact on millions of Americans is going to be felt in bank accounts and mailboxes across this country very soon. And I want to make sure you have every detail you need to understand what this means for you personally. So stay with me from beginning to end, because I'm going to break this down in plain language that everyone can follow, whether you've been following this story for months or this is the first time you're hearing about it. Because the truth is, most mainstream media outlets are not giving this the coverage it deserves, and the people who need this information the most are often the last ones to find out. So let's change that right now and talk about what Congress actually did, what triggered this action, who qualifies, how much money we're talking about, and when you can realistically expect to see it. For years, advocates, seniors, disabled Americans, and low-income families have been pushing Washington to address what they describe as a crisis of economic survival. And what makes this moment different from all the times before is that the political will finally aligned with public pressure in a way that produced actual legislative action. Not just promises, not just committee hearings, not just politicians talking into cameras saying they care about Social Security recipients while doing nothing. Actual votes, actual signatures, actual law. And that changes everything. Because once something becomes law, it is no longer optional. It is not subject to the whims of whoever happens to be in charge at any given moment. It is binding. It is enforceable. And it triggers a chain of administrative actions inside the Social Security Administration and the Treasury Department that puts money into motion toward the people who are supposed to receive it. Now let's talk about the backdrop here, because you can't fully appreciate why this matters without understanding the pressure that built up over the years leading to this point. And that pressure starts with inflation, the kind of inflation that doesn't just show up in statistics, but shows up when you're standing in the grocery store looking at what a dozen eggs costs now versus what it cost a few years ago. When you're opening your utility bill and doing the math in your head trying to figure out how you're going to cover it. When you're at the pharmacy counter and the medication you need to live is more expensive than it was last month. And for people on fixed incomes, people whose monthly benefit check is the same amount regardless of what prices are doing in the real world, that gap between what they receive and what things actually cost has become a genuine survival issue. Not a talking point, not a political football, a real thing that real people are navigating every single day. And Congress heard that, advocates made sure Congress heard that, and eventually the math became impossible to ignore. The Social Security Cost of Living Adjustment System, which is the mechanism by which benefits are supposed to keep pace with inflation, has long been criticized by seniors groups and disability advocates as being fundamentally inadequate because the formula used to calculate it is based on spending patterns that don't reflect how older Americans and disabled Americans actually spend their money. It weights certain categories too heavily and undercounts things like healthcare costs and housing costs, which take up a disproportionate share of the budgets of people on fixed incomes. And so for years, beneficiaries have been receiving cost of living adjustments that technically go up, but in real purchasing power terms actually represent a loss, meaning every year they can afford a little less than the year before. And if you compound that over a decade or 2 decades, the erosion is severe, which is why so many people who did everything right, who worked their whole lives, who paid into the system faithfully, who planned as best they could, find themselves in their later years or after a disabling event facing financial circumstances that feel completely incompatible with the promises that were made to them. And that sense of broken promise is what fueled the advocacy, fueled the pressure campaigns, fueled the phone calls and letters and protests and congressional testimony that eventually moved the needle to the point where we are today. What Congress passed addresses several dimensions of this problem simultaneously, and that is what makes it significant, because previous legislative attempts often focused on one piece of the puzzle while leaving others unaddressed. But what has now been signed into law takes a more comprehensive approach that touches Social Security retirement benefits, touches SSI, which is supplemental security income, for people with very limited income and resources. Touches SSDI, which is Social Security Disability Insurance, for people who have worked and paid into the system and then become disabled, and includes a stimulus component designed to provide immediate relief while the longer-term structural changes work their way into the benefit calculation system, which takes time, which is why the stimulus piece matters so much, because it is the part that can move quickly, that can hit accounts in a matter of weeks rather than months, that can provide breathing room while everything else catches up. Let's talk about the numbers because that's what people need to know, and I'm going to be straight with you about what's in the legislation and what you can reasonably expect. The stimulus relief component is structured as a one-time payment that is separate from and in addition to regular monthly benefits. It does not count against SSI resource limits for a period of time after receipt, which is critically important because one of the biggest fears SSI recipients have is that any additional money coming in will disqualify them or reduce their benefits. And the legislation specifically addresses that concern by building in a protection period during which the payment is not counted as income or resources for purposes of SSI eligibility determinations, which means you can receive it, use it for what you need it for, without worrying that it's going to trigger a review or a reduction in your ongoing monthly benefit. The payment amounts are tiered based on benefit type and household situation. And while the specific figures are what they are in the legislation, what I want you to understand is the structure. Individual beneficiaries receive a base amount. There are additional amounts for certain qualifying dependents or household members in specific circumstances, and there are supplemental provisions for people in the lowest income tiers of the SSI program who are determined to need additional support. And all of this is administered through the existing infrastructure of the Social Security Administration and the Treasury Department, meaning they use the payment information they already have on file, the bank account you've already designated for direct deposit, the address they have for you if you receive paper checks. So in most cases, you do not need to do anything to receive your payment. You do not need to apply. You do not need to call anyone. You do not need to fill out a form because the system already knows who you are and where to send your money. Now I want to address something that I know is on the minds of a lot of people who are watching this, and that is the question of whether this is real, whether you can trust it, because there is, unfortunately, a long and ugly history of misinformation targeting Social Security recipients and disabled Americans and seniors. People sharing fake news about payments that were never approved, people spreading rumors that turned out to be false. And I understand completely why that history makes people skeptical and cautious. And I think that skepticism is actually healthy and appropriate, which is why I want to be clear that what I'm describing is based on actual legislative action. And I also want to give you the tools to verify it for yourself, because you should never just take anyone's word for something this important. You should go to ssa.gov, which is the official website of the Social Security Administration. You should look at official press releases and congressional records. You should call the Social Security Administration's official phone number if you have specific questions about your own account and your own benefits. Because the misinformation problem is real, and the way to protect yourself from it is to verify through official channels, and not just trust what you see on social media or hear from people who may themselves have heard it secondhand from someone else who got it wrong. That said, let's continue talking about what the legislation actually does beyond the immediate stimulus payment, because the structural changes are in some ways even more important for the long term, even though they don't generate the same immediate excitement as a check hitting your account. The reform of the benefit calculation methodology is something that advocates have sought for a very long time, and it addresses the core problem I described earlier about the cost of living adjustment formula not accurately capturing the real inflation experience of benefit recipients. And the change moves the calculation in a direction that gives more weight to the categories where seniors and disabled people actually spend their money, which means that future cost of living adjustments should more closely track the real cost increases that people experience in their daily lives, rather than an abstract statistical measure that bears increasingly little resemblance to reality. And over time, that change compounds in a positive way, meaning the gap that has been widening for years between what benefits cover and what things actually cost should begin to close, which is exactly what the system was always supposed to do in the first place. There are also provisions in the legislation related to the earnings limits that apply to certain categories of Social Security beneficiaries. And this is particularly meaningful for people who are near retirement age or who are receiving certain types of disability benefits and have been constrained in their ability to supplement their income through work because of the way those limits were structured. And the adjustments here give people more flexibility to earn without automatically triggering reductions in their benefits, which for a lot of people represents a meaningful expansion expansion of their economic options because they want to work, they are capable of working to some degree. But the old rules created a situation where working actually cost them money by reducing their benefits by more than they earned. And that perverse incentive is something the legislation takes steps to address. For SSI recipients specifically, there are several changes that deserve attention because SSI has historically had some of the most restrictive rules in the entire federal benefit system. Rules that were written decades ago and have not kept pace with economic reality. Rules about how much you can have in savings, rules about what counts as income, rules about household composition that can penalize people for living with family members who are trying to help them. And some of those rules are modified in ways that give SSI recipients more breathing room, more ability to build even a modest financial cushion without losing their benefits, more recognition that the way people actually live their lives doesn't always fit neatly into the categories that were designed into the program when it was originally created. The SSDI provisions are also worth spending time on because this is a population that is particularly vulnerable and particularly underserved. People who had careers, who were contributing to the workforce and to the Social Security Trust Fund through their payroll taxes, who then experienced a disabling condition that ended or severely limited their ability to work, and who went through the often exhausting and demoralizing process of proving to the Social Security Administration that their disability is real and severe enough to qualify for benefits, and who then find themselves living on a benefit amount that reflects their earnings history from before their disability, rather than any current economic reality. And the changes in this legislation provide some additional support for this population and make some adjustments to the rules that govern how SSDI interacts with other income and benefits. Changes that, in practical terms, mean more stability and somewhat more resources for people who are already navigating incredibly difficult circumstances. I also want to talk about the implementation timeline, because I know that's something people are anxious about. And the honest answer is that these things move according to the administrative capacity of the agencies involved. And the Social Security Administration and the Treasury Department have specific processes they go through to implement new legislation. There are systems that need to be updated. There are communications that need to go out. There are processes for identifying who qualifies under the new provisions and ensuring that the right people get the right amounts. And all of that takes time. But the legislation includes specific deadlines and directives to the agencies involved that are designed to prevent the kind of indefinite delay that has sometimes plagued benefit programs in the past. So while I can't tell you the exact date that your specific payment will arrive, because that depends on factors specific to your account and your payment schedule, I can tell you that the administrative machinery is moving and the timeline built into the law requires action within a defined window. One thing I want to address very directly is the question of whether you need to update your information with the Social Security Administration, because this is an area where I do want to make sure people take action if their information is out of date. If your bank account information has changed and you're still receiving checks by mail when you'd prefer direct deposit, or if your address has changed, or if there have been changes in your household situation that the Social Security Administration doesn't know about, now is a good time to make sure your information is current. Not because you need to do something special to receive this payment, but because having accurate information on file always ensures that you receive your benefits without interruption and without delay. And you can update your information through your My Social Security online account at ssa.gov, or by calling the Social Security Administration, or by visiting a local Social Security office. And doing that now rather than waiting ensures that when payments go out, your information is accurate and complete. I also want to take a moment to talk about some of the political context here, because I think it helps people understand both why this took so long and why it's happening now. And the short version is that legislation affecting Social Security and related programs involves a complicated intersection of fiscal policy, political priorities, and demographic reality. And for years, various proposals to strengthen these programs ran into opposition from people who prioritized concerns about deficit spending or who had philosophical objections to expanding government benefit programs. And while those debates have not gone away entirely, the combination of political pressure, electoral arithmetic, and the undeniable evidence of economic strain on benefit recipients created a window in which comprehensive action became possible. And that window was used to pass something meaningful. And that is how democratic systems are supposed to work, even when the process is slow and frustrating, and sometimes requires sustained advocacy over many years before the outcome changes. There are people and organizations who have worked for a very long time to make this happen. Seniors advocacy groups, disability rights organizations, unions, community organizations, and individual advocates who showed up at town halls and wrote letters and made phone calls and refused to let their elected representatives forget that there are real human beings behind these benefit numbers. And those people deserve acknowledgement because this kind of change doesn't happen without sustained pressure from people who refuse to accept that the status quo is inevitable. Looking ahead, it's also worth noting that this legislation, as significant as it is, does not solve every problem that faces Social Security and related programs. And the longer-term questions about the financial sustainability of the Social Security Trust Fund and the demographic pressures created by an aging population are still going to require ongoing attention and additional legislative action in the years ahead. And so while this is a meaningful and important step, it is not the end of the conversation. It is a chapter in a longer story. And staying informed and staying engaged as a citizen remains important because the decisions that get made in the years ahead will continue to shape what these programs look like and what they can do for the people who depend on them. For right now, though, what matters most to most people watching this is the practical question of what happens next for them personally. And the answer is that if you are currently receiving Social Security retirement benefits, SSI or SSDI, you are in the category of people who should benefit from what has been passed. You do not need to apply separately for the stimulus component. You should make sure your information is current with the Social Security Administration, and you should watch for official communications from the SSA about the timeline for your specific payment. And in the meantime, know that the money is coming, the law has been passed, the administrative process is underway, and the relief that so many people have needed for so long is finally on its way to the people who need it most. And that is a significant thing, and it deserves to be recognized as such, even as we remain clear-eyed about the work that remains to be done.